Hi, thanks to everyone here in the room and those of you out in virtual land who have stuck with us thus far. It's been an exciting ride and it's not over yet. Thanks for joining for On the Open Access Road Again, Is the Value of the Big Deal Declining? I'm Heather Staines, Senior Consultant at Delta Think, and I'll be moderating here in the room today. Just a quick intro for our speakers and contributors, so that we take the maximum time for discussion.
No video.
Well, if they can hear me, that's okay. We'll get the video going. I feel better if you actually can't see me. I'm joking. So joining us here on stage today, Michael Levine-Clark, who is Dean of Libraries at the University of Denver. Jason Price of the SCELC Library Consortia. He is Research and Community Communications Director. And in the virtual space, John McDonald of EBSCO Information Services, and he is Director of Product Management, Assessment, and Analytics. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Michael, and hopefully the video will magically appear.
Great. Thanks, Heather, and thank you for sticking around to attend one of the last sessions of the conference. We are, John McDonald wasn't able to be with us today. He was responsible for a tremendous amount of data crunching and is now taking a much deserved break, but is going to be on participating by chat, and we'll try to respond to questions along the way. John and Jason and I have been doing a series of presentations and studies about the value of the big deal, broadly speaking. We did a presentation at Charleston last year where we looked at journal level usage data within UNSUB and tried to understand how the various factors that are measured in UNSUB, again at the journal level, contribute to the value of the big deal, and thinking about what unbundling might look like. In March at ER&L, we pivoted our research a little bit, and we focused on the question of post-cancellation access, and specifically how valuable is post-cancellation access after you cancel a big deal. Along with that, we added aggregator access in that study. And now we're asking another question about the value of the big deal in the context of the increasing publication of open access content. We've all seen headlines like, I guess we're not seeing the slides, are we? Huh, okay, now we see the slides. No wonder, no, I gotta go back a couple slides. This is, we didn't get a chuckle on this slide, so now I understand why. Yeah, okay. So John is busy with more important things. The presentations we did at previous conferences, and now the headlines that we've seen at over many years about the growth in open access publishing. And there's no doubt that that's happening, but overall growth across the entire scholarly publishing landscape doesn't necessarily have any impact on an individual big deal. And the question we really want to understand is, how does the growth of a particular publisher's open access content factor into the relative value of the big deal? Heather is at Delta Think, and Delta Think is doing really deep dives into scholarly publishing marketplace with a focus on open access. And there's a lot of really valuable information, much of it publicly available on their website. They have measured the open access market in a couple of ways, and either way that you look at this, it shows tremendous growth. So the 2019 to 2020 market value of open access went up 25% in 1 year. the year-over-year growth from 2019 to 2020 for the number of articles went up 20%. Those are tremendous, right? And that's across the entire scholarly publishing landscape. There's good detailed information in these quotes, but I want to focus on a couple of things. One, that this 25% increase from 2019 to 2020 in terms of market value is much larger than the underlying growth of the scholarly journals market, right? So scholarly journal publishing is also going up, but not nearly at that level. It's down in the single digit range. And the other item of note is that around 36% of all the scholarly articles published in 2020 were published as a paid open access model of some site, either hybrid or fully open. But that accounts for just 9% of the overall market value, right? So 36% of publications, but only 9% of the value. Here's more data from Delta Think. We're at the journal level here. And this is a graph showing the growth in the number of open access journals from 2009 to 2020 from different sources. So from DOAJ, from Ulrichs, from other places. And the numbers themselves aren't what I'm trying to show you here, but whichever one you're looking at, it's significant growth every year with a steady upward trajectory. And that's the journals. What about articles? Also from Delta Think, and I want to make clear that on this slide, this is projecting into the future to 2023. Right somewhere in the middle of this graph is 2020. But in 2020, 1.1 million articles in red were published in an open access, paid open access model. So that includes hybrid or fully OA. 947,000 full articles published in fully open access journals, and 171,000 open access articles published in hybrid journals. And the numbers are steadily increasing for all of those and are projected to continue to increase. Another glimpse at the same data, the red line is all open access as a percentage of the market. And in 2020, 36% of the publishing market is open access articles. 30.5% of that is open access articles in fully gold open access journals, and 5.5% of it is hybrid. By 2023, almost half of the articles published are going to be open access in one format or another. But we're interested in the big deal, and the big deal in some ways is the size of the market. The overall publishing volume doesn't really matter. What matters is what's published by a particular publisher. So our study looks at trends over a 4 or a 5 year period for 20 libraries and two large publishers. We contacted libraries to ask for data about their usage from these publishers. And we have 8 libraries that are research 1 or doctoral very high research activity, and 12 others that range downward from R2 or high research activity down to small baccalaureates. So a group of 8 very high research libraries and a group of 12 much smaller to medium size in terms of research. And then two large publishers. One publisher, we used 5 years of counter data, and another used 4 years of counter data. And that's just a sort of in terms of how you pull data out of their platforms. Here's information about those 2 publishers, also from Delta Think. And publisher 1 on the top is the one where we have 5 years of data. Publisher 2 on the bottom is where we have 4 years of data. And while these show some trends over that 4 and 5 year period, the takeaway from this slide is that for these 2 publishers, the option to publish in open access form is there somewhere between 85 and 95% in terms of journals, right? So the red in the middle is the number of journals or the percentage of journals that are hybrid. So if you want to publish with publisher 2, you can almost certainly publish open access if you can pay for it. Well, in terms of the number of articles that's actually published, it's much lower than that, not surprisingly. So for publisher 1, over this 5-year period, the percentage of articles published in fully gold open access journals ranged from about 23% up to about 25%. And the hybrid percentage went from about 4.4% up to about 9.3%. Publisher 2, it's the same pattern, but smaller percentages. They're down at 6.5 to 11.5% fully gold and 4% roughly across the board for hybrid. There's actually a slight decline in hybrid for publisher 2. There's an increase in hybrid for publisher 1. Both publishers are increasing their gold article publication. So we thought all of that context was important because the question that we really want to ask is how usage is changing, or whether it's changing, and therefore is the value changing. We asked libraries for their counter reports. We asked for counter release 5, the title master report. If you know your counter, those are the elements that we incorporated into the data set. But the one that I think is important to mention specifically is the access type, which breaks it down into controlled and OA gold. And it therefore allows you to look at usage of gold or open access and licensed content separately and to do this sort of analysis. We had to clean up the data, which you always need to do. We decided to exclude fully open access journals. And that's because these are things that are available to you on that publisher's website, whether you have access to the big deal or not, right? Whether you're a subscriber or not, you can go in and you can get access to that content. We use the fully gold OA title lists from each publisher to then compare to our large data set of usage. And across these 20 libraries, we removed a little over 10,000 open access institution and journal and institution pairs, which accounted for about 1.4 million usages. We retained the gold titles that had controlled usage also indicated, because our assumption was that these were titles where maybe only a year or 2 of that title was open. The rest of it was behind a paywall, and we wanted to measure that. And we also kept all hybrid journals in the set. We also had to remove outliers, and these are 5 real sets of data with made up journal names, but these showed up in the data. And so at this university, this first university here, there was a title that had 20,000 uses in 1 year and almost none in the rest of those years. And what is interesting is that these are probably breaches of some sort, right? Something unusual went on with these titles. None of these institutions said, oh, we can't send you data from this publisher because we know we had a breach, right? And this was not something that any of these institutions noticed. And that's an aside, but I think I think it's important to have a better understanding of this. So we looked at these titles and we removed outliers when these sorts of extreme patterns happened. And we ended up removing 863 outliers, which account for about 0.6% of the total usage. Here's just a sort of more detailed look at the content that we removed in declining order from the institution with the highest amount of outlier usage down to the lowest amount. And you can see it's across many different years at these institutions. Our criteria were that we took out any title that had over 1,000 requests in 1 year, but fewer than 100 in the preceding or ensuing year. So those are pretty big shifts. And then, or any one where the target year is greater than two times all other years' requests put together. So for example, if there was a title that had 4,000 uses in one year, but the other 4 years added up to less than 2,000, we removed that title as well. And again, it accounted for a relatively small number of titles, but a lot of data, a lot of usage, I mean. So we then took our data and we put this all in a data set. This is just a glimpse of usage at the sort of broad level of Carnegie class. We had a group of, again, 8 libraries in the R1 very high research activity category. Their average student FTE is 37,000. These are large institutions. The R2 plus group, the smaller institutions, is 12 institutions with an average student FTE of 8,700, much smaller. At the R1 group, there's a higher amount of usage per student FTE, right? So there's 40 in 2017, there were 42 uses per student FTE across these R1s. At the R2s, it was lower, only 15 uses per student. In both cases, the open access gold usage is roughly 10% of the controlled usage. But in the R1s, that usage of OA gold has gone up steadily. And in the R2s, it's actually, it went up briefly and then declined over time, right? So there is a little bit of a different pattern there. And now I'm gonna turn it over to Jason, who's gonna walk us through the data and start answering the question of whether the value of the big deal is declining.
Thanks, Michael. So on to that question. The standard metric of package value is cost per use. If there is an increase in total cost or a decrease in total usage or both, that results in increasing cost per use and therefore a decline in package value. However, to take into account the underlying usage of freely available publisher-hosted gold open access articles into account, we need to remove that usage from the total usage in the denominator. Cost per controlled use does just that. So the next few slides address each of these 3 factors: total cost, total usage, and gold OA usage, showing a detailed view and a summary view of each trend over the 5 years of the study. The final few slides bring them back together, comparing cost per use and cost per controlled use over time. In this detail figure, and each of the ones that follow, publisher 1 is on the left and publisher 2 is on the right. And each line represents an individual institution, and their colors are consistent throughout. The 8 hash lines are the very high research institutions, or R1s for short, and the solid lines are high research intensity, or R2s, on down to baccalaureate institutions. I doubt it's a surprise to anyone that most of you, or any of you, that most institutions' costs increased over time. Here we can see that publisher 1 shows more variation in the cumulative change in costs, with a couple of R1 institutions showing massive increases and 1 each that was flat or declined. Whereas publisher 2 shows the same 2 institutions with the favorable cost changes from publisher 1 had reduced costs for publisher 2 as well. But by and large, we can see that costs are increasing over time, but how much are they increasing? So looking at the average cumulative cost increases across the 20 institutions for the last 3 years, we can see that publisher 1's package cost in purple increased 4 to 6% per year, and publisher 2's package cost in red increased 2 to 4% per year, with the error bars showing a standard error of the mean. Okay, so no real surprises here, but perhaps some detectable differences. These rising costs are going to create some downward pressure on package value. Moving on to usage, we plotted total item requests on a log scale to make it easier to visualize trends. Perhaps it's no surprise that the larger research intensive institutions, the hashed lines, had the highest usage for both publishers. Also, even after removing outliers, we can see that some institutions showed large fluctuations in usage from year to year. For publisher one, 14 of the 20 institutions' usage increased from 2017 through 2020, despite the start of work from home in March of 2020. In contrast, for publisher two, about 15 out of 20 institutions' usage declined over the same period of time. So looking at average usage for each publisher, we can ask whether total usage is declining. For publisher one, in purple, the answer is no. In fact, the increase from 2017 to 2020 was almost 40%, or an average of 13% increase per year. Usage of publisher two's content declined about 15% over the same period, starting in 2019 and resulting in an average decline of about 5% per year. So for publisher two, both the increase in price and the decrease in usage will contribute to declining value. Well, the third factor, and perhaps the one that we were most interested in, that can impact the value of a journal package over time is the proportion of total usage that's freely available within the packages. As you can see, that proportion is fairly small and fairly consistent across the libraries. We're showing these data on a 0 to 100% scale to remind you that 85 to 95% of the usage is still coming from paywalled or controlled content. But when we zoom in on this same data, we can see different trends in publisher hosted open access usage between the publishers. Publisher one shows a clear increase in the proportion of OA usage, while publisher two is less clear and suggests maybe a peak midway through. Looking at the averages, the differences are clear. Proportional use of publisher one's hybrid open access articles is increasing by about 1 to 1.5% per year, there in purple, whereas publisher two's profile is effectively flat. And on the right, though, here's a second reminder that these exact same data plotted on a 0 to 100% scale show that the annual change in hybrid OA usage has been quite small. So now we can move on to cost per use. Putting cost and total usage together to calculate that, we see that institutions tend to experience flat and decreasing cost per use decreasing cost per use for publisher one, and flat or increasing cost per use for publisher two. Okay, are you ready for cost per controlled use? Don't blink or you'll miss it. The lines move up a smidge, reflecting the removal of hybrid open access used from the denominator, but are very similar in shape. So toggling back, this is cost per use. This is cost per controlled use. If you can kind of, there is a little change in shape. It's not just, nudged up by, different size there, but it really, there's not a big difference. And that's because it's just reflecting that, that hybrid use as a small percentage. But in this summary, we can compare cost per controlled use and cost per use more directly. As we'd expect, cost per controlled use, shown by the connected solid lines, is always higher than traditional cost per use, and the difference is dictated by that proportion of hybrid open access use. To the extent that transformative agreements lead to more rapid increase in the proportion of hybrid OA content and use, these lines should diverge, with cost per controlled use increasing faster than traditional cost per use over time. For this reason, we recommend that cost per controlled use should be used as a standard measure going forward. So it's clear here, I think, that we have, well, actually, I'll go to the next slide. So bringing cost per controlled use data together from the two publishers onto the same axis, the difference in their trends is clear. The Purple line, publisher one, shows a slow decrease in cost per controlled use, whereas publisher two shows a pretty rapid increase in cost per controlled use. Then we can flip cost per controlled use on its head by reversing the y-axis to acknowledge that increasing cost per controlled use is equivalent to declining value. So here on the right, we can see that while publisher one's package in purple is slowly increasing in value, publisher two's showed a precipitous decline in 2019 and 2020. So in summary, from the data, we saw that value did decline for one of the two publishers. Average cost increased 2 to 6% per year. Average usage changed by between +10 and -5% per year over a 4-year period. And it was by far the more variable, the furthest range of any of these variables. And then the average proportion of hybrid OA usage changed by just 0.1% per year. Turn it over to Michael for conclusion.
So some final thoughts. The change in value that we saw seems to be more heavily influenced by overall usage than by the change in the proportion of hybrid OA article usage, right? So it's really about overall usage. There doesn't appear to be much difference among the site licensed libraries that we looked at or among the publishers that we looked at in the proportion of the open versus controlled usage that was going on these two publisher sites. And this is again a wide range of research activity at these different institutions, and yet the patterns were not that different. Trends are likely to have been affected by COVID, certainly, right? We know that, we assume that, but how, I'm not really sure, right? Did COVID help the usage go up? Did it drive it down? Did it impact one publisher different than the other? We have no idea. And that's, I think, an important acknowledgement and something that we probably want to pay attention to over additional years. It's unlikely that these trends have been influenced by transformative agreements in any way yet. But as more libraries enter into transformative agreements and therefore more hybrid publishing happens, those impacts could grow. We do think that those costs per controlled use will increase marginally year over year as more hybrid articles are published. And this last point is a really important one, that we've been publishing a lot of material, or these publishers have been publishing a lot of material over a lot of years in paywall journals. Adding in even significant amounts of hybrid content in 2020 and 2019 and so on makes a very small impact in the overall amount of content that might be found on any given search. So there, it makes sense that the overall usage is relatively little, has had relatively little impact based on the availability of hybrid content. So in some ways, these are conclusions, but I think they're also in some ways questions that we still need to answer. And that's it for that. I think we'll turn it over now to Heather, and we'll do questions.
Yeah, thanks for that. I know that's a lot of data to absorb in a really short period of time. I just wanted to draw attention. Michael mentioned that a lot of the charts and graphs did come from our open access data and analytics tool. We have the data sources for each one of those. And so I've asked before the final version of the slides get shared that the source credit be put on, just so that you know which data sources are behind which chart, because that's really important. And I don't know that off the top of my head. So if you have a specific question, you can get in touch with me and I can go into the tool and actually look. But that's one of the, we're very understanding about, when folks want to use images, it's important that that stuff travel with it. So stay tuned for that. I just had a couple of questions that occurred to me while you guys were talking. The two publishers that you use, without giving anything away, were their overall portfolios across the board by subject area? I mean, are they comparable to each other in the mix of subject areas generally that they could that have been?
Yeah, there weren't any, there wasn't one that was a subject specific publisher. That's right. They were broader.
And then the other thing, and I think you may have said this and I may have missed it because I was frantically taking my notes. It's 1 year, partial year worth of data, but the increase in article output that we saw start to happen in 2020 with publishers, as researchers must have gone through their backlog, and a lot of publishers were actually adding more articles. Again, it's a small number in that overall usage that you mentioned, but did you see anything interesting from that standpoint at all?
I mean, I think the answer is we didn't really look, because since we were looking at overall usage and we didn't look at usage by year to try and see if that was varying, we couldn't really have that level of resolution. But it's one of the things that I think really we wanted to make as a main message, is that, yeah, the proportion of articles being published open, even within these packages, in the current year is really high, but even a massive increase in a particular year, either of the total number of articles or of the proportion of articles, is not necessarily going to have a big impact when you're looking at usage across the whole. Usually it's like the last 20 or 25 years of content that's accessible through the big deal. So we didn't look at it separately from that, and we didn't see any big changes. Did see what was looking like the beginnings of a trend toward cost per controlled use going up a little bit faster than cost per use when you compare the two. So I think there might be some evidence of some influence, but it's really early, and the changes are small, so it's a little soon to tell.
Yeah, it's go to take a question just a second, but it's fascinating to me that when we were looking at we do a survey every year of publishers, and it seems that massive increase in submissions appears in the OA side of the equation, and that type of a content type, publishers can be a little bit more agile when they add that in compared to the subscription where it's been paid in advance, and there's a certain amount of in percentage increase that is even possible. So we're continuing to look at how that mix of license type plays out over time. We have a question here in the room, and John, after we take the question here in the room, but you can let me know if there's a question from the online attendee.
Oh, wait, 1 second. I can kind of hear you, but I don't think they out there could hear you at all.
Okay, mic's on now. I'm Athena Hepner from the University of Central Florida, and I've been dealing with our usage statistics for a long time. And anyone who does deal with counterstats for a long time knows that there's a lot of things that can push them up or down, from, while we changed our discovery layer to our authentication system, to the vendor themselves had a platform migration and changed the way they present the full text on their site. So first question is, did either of your publishers have anything that may have affected their usage statistics that were related to platforms or technology or that sort of thing?
So we didn't really think about it, but we did try to look at the data as it came in to ask if there were any leaps or changes that were consistent. I mean, it's really still only 4 or 5 years, but in most cases where we saw those big changes, it was at individual institutions, not across all of them. So that would be less likely to be a platform issue, right? And it also tended to zigzag. So it was up 1 year and then down the next, and maybe back up again the year after. And that, as we saw that data, which was even more dramatic before we removed the outliers, as you would expect, we expected that basically any major influence on data was more likely to be caused by systematic downloading at an individual institution in a particular year or over a period of time limited to a year, rather than that dramatically changing things. But I guess it's possible that the difference between publisher 1 and publisher 2 would be explained by that, but because of the variation around these means, it didn't really look like it, and also the pattern of the change. I hope that makes sense.
Sure. And my follow-up is sort of a plea both to academics and to publishers to stop making it so hard to share counter data with each other. I mean, why is this at all secretive? It could be anonymized and shared. I would really love some transparency about what's going on more globally, because this is an area your data needs, the more you have, the better, the clearer your picture will be. And I think we all deserve to have a clear picture of what's happening.
Yes. No, it really, I mean, imagine if we had the ability to sort of look at every publisher's data or every institution's usage data from every publisher and what we could understand. And I think that benefits the publishers too, honestly.
Yeah, and I would say part of the reason we were being so careful here and neither confirm or deny and really identify the publishers is because we're not talking just about their underlying counter use. We're also looking at value and institution costs, and when you start to do that, it starts to get more sensitive, right? But yeah, sharing usage data and being able to do that more. I mean, that's part of why we did this, is to try to get some sense of what is the content text. And I work for a consortium that serves mostly libraries in the smaller section in the R2 to baccalaureate. Understanding, well, where are we relative to those others, and are the trends different or the same is a value for sure.
And if somebody feels uncomfortable sharing their counter data with us, we would be happy to help you to do the same sort of study with your own data that you could then share with us. In other words, you could share the results of the data.
Yeah, and I would add, I'm currently on the counter board of directors, and so I'll definitely take that information back. And we've been looking at what types of initiatives counter can look into moving forward in terms of the data. And I will say, I mentioned this the other day in another talk, but open access, gold open access publishers that are not counter compliant, please, for the benefit of everyone and studies like this, but also for your libraries, you want to have relationships now with libraries. There's agreements being put into place, but if you're not counter compliant, these types of apples to apples analyses just can't happen. So it's my counter commercial. John, are there any questions online?
I'm not sure we can hear him.
Okay.
Message to
Yeah, thanks, Heather. A couple of good questions did come in through chat. And I did answer a couple of them, but I'll pose one to Jason and Michael because it got asked a couple of times. But Linda asked if either of these publishers are embarking on transformative agreements that would impact the 20 libraries in the study. And I reconfirmed from the presentation it's possible, but we didn't ask for an accounting of their transformative agreements. And it's unlikely that they've got enough publishing over the last few years to really impact that. Another question that came in that I somewhat answered was around focusing on aggregators. And I just said we may be looking at that in a future study, but we didn't for this one. Then we had a question both from Emily and from Ellen, essentially asking about usage that comes outside of authenticated use through the library's IP range and what effect that may have had on the study. So Jason and Michael, do you guys want to speak to that?
Sure. So unauthenticated use, we didn't take into account here. So it is possible that users who were covered under these site licenses were using the content from home and we weren't able to measure that. But if they were logged in and accessing it through the publisher platform, then we would have been able to measure it. So is unauthenticated use by your users a part of the value of the big deal? It could be. We kind of more narrowly defined it and said, we're looking at the use that we can measure as part of what your libraries are paying for their users to be able to access. And so in essence, that unauthenticated use could certainly mean there was more use of the open content. We know there was massively more use of the open content in outside of what was measurable because through IP range, but that we didn't include that or consider that to be part of the value of the big deal to that local institution, right? So if it's open to everyone. That yes, that means there's usage outside. The question more it was, if we're measuring usage and there's a lot of that usage that was freely available to everybody that had that you didn't need to be authenticated to use, then does that create a greater decline than otherwise?
And just to go back to the transformative agreement question, both of these publishers are participating in transformative agreements at various places. It probably just not long enough to have made a difference yet.
As U.S. institutions, and with the range that we were in, and we did ask folks to let us know if there was a major change in their package at any point during the term. And so we would have assumed they would have let us know. Also by 2020, there just weren't a lot of them going on in the US. So that helped as well. One thing I want to say about the aggregator question, because it gives me the chance to make kind of a broader point, is that aggregator usage and usage of green open access and all of the other content that is out there that is not hosted on the publisher site is also important, right? So another way to measure value would decrease that denominator, that total usage more. If you said, well, how much of the usage in this package was of content that I couldn't get anywhere else on the publisher site, or by searching Google and there was somebody put it on a scholar sharing site or whatever else. We didn't go to that level in this study. And aggregator content actually is another place you could go. So if you can get it someplace else, then it's not necessarily locally, at least, of as much value to you. So we had planned to actually define that, which the makers of Unsub, our research has defined as net cost per page use as an additional line, which would have been higher than controlled use because it included more outside use, right? And still are planning to do that. The challenge was looking for over the last 4 or 5 years. Unsub is not designed to take in data from 2018, 2017, and 2016. We thought it would work anyway, but it didn't. There were some title match issues and it didn't seem to come out. So, but I'd love, and I think it's important to, if you want to really assess this more deeply, and if your library or your institution is really effective at making sure your researchers are getting to all that content out there, whether it's on the publisher platform or anybody else, anywhere else, then we need that other data. And so that's a next step that will kind of define a more of a top and bottom estimate of the cost per use, taking into account freely available open access.
I think we have time for one more question because we're almost at time. John,
Great.
keep it short.
I'm John Dove. I'm an ambassador for the Directory of Open Access Journals. And first, I have to say, you two guys are fabulous. You're like, Jason, you're like our own Steve Karnacki in this industry, because you really drill down into the data. So, and I remember the one that you did 4 years ago where you talked about Sci-Hub. So Sci-Hub would obviously be another important thing in terms of usage. But let me just say, DOAJ has done a lot of work around volunteers in order to extend the boundaries of various spectrums in terms of what's available in peer-reviewed open access. And they've just allowed me now to bring on a volunteer librarian who is skilled in statistics and other things to look at where are there some things that actually may disparage the open access journals versus the paywall journals, because the paywall journals have such an enormous amount of income coming in that they can pay for a lot of machinery which the purely open access journals, or the tiny open access journals that are at
Sure.
the edges of disciplines of languages and geography and discipline and so forth. So we're trying to look to see what's the value that DOAJ brings to the table uniquely, because only with them at the job are we reaching out with that kind of diversity and inclusion. So, but thanks, you guys are doing a great job.
Real quick response.
Yeah, so I'll say, I guess, I think having an understanding of usage across all scholarly content and all open content, and maybe trying to understand how the availability of an article on a particular topic impacts the usage of another article would matter.
And I mean, I think there's lots of ways to think about pathways to open access. And I think, you know, the DOAJ and the fully gold pathway is one really important pathway. We were focusing in on this other pathway, which is hybrid. And that's partly because, you know, faculty and researchers and reputations of journals means that they tend to want to publish in journals with, you know, top impact factor for reputations, whatever that kind of thing is. They don't want to be told, well, you need to publish in those journals, not these journals. And so one piece of it is making more of that hybrid content open, which is what transformative agreements largely, or many of them at least, are about. And so this was to begin to think about that and to focus on the usage of the hybrid content. And, you know, I think the question was, well, are we paying way too much now? Has this made a massive decrease already in the value of my big deal because there's so much open content in there? There is a lot of open content going in each successive year, but it's still a small proportion compared to the whole. And the usage patterns, to me, were remarkably similar across these libraries. The fact that these lines weren't all spaghettied all over the place and impossible to figure out was pretty impressive. That the trends are similar and the variation in the level of that open use is very small within these journal package, major commercial publisher journal package.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it at that. Let's thank our speakers, Jason, Michael, and John, for the online moderation. We're going to get the band back together for UKSG, so the data analysis is going to continue.
Thank you, everybody.